Hey, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us for Telling Stories About Old School Cinema Icons, a conversation with Charles Casillo, hosted by 1455 Literary Arts. I'm Sean Murphy. I'm the founder and executive director of 1455. I welcome you and thank you for participating in our third annual summer festival. This is by far our biggest and best yet, and I continue to be delighted as we really dive into attacking storytelling from a variety of different angles. And this next session with our special guest is no exception. Let me introduce Charles and then we'll jump right in. We got a lot to talk about. And we were talking right before we came on. Charles was wondering if his bio was long, and my opinion is it's not bragging if it's all true. So I want to read the bio because it's impressive and it excites me to see another writer with all these bylines. So Charles was born in New York City and started his career as an actor, studying at the Academy of Dramatic Arts. Through the years, his career began to shift more towards writing. His celebrity interviews, personality profiles, short stories, articles, and reviews have appeared in, among others, the New York Times, the LA Times, New York Magazine, Los Angeles Review of Books, The Advocate, Vice, Interview, and many others. He's the author of the brand new biography, Elizabeth and Monty, as well as Marilyn Monroe, The Private Life of a Public Icon and Outlaw. His fiction includes the novels The Fame Game, The Marilyn Diaries, and a collection of stories, Boys, Lost and Found, which is a great title. He is considered an expert on the life and death of Marilyn Monroe and has appeared in myriad documentaries, including Marilyn and Her Men on Lifetime, The Killing of Marilyn Monroe, and Scandalous, The Death of Marilyn Monroe. He's also penned the neo-noir thriller film Let Me Die Quietly, and he wrote the movie Fetish, in which he co-starred with Dame Joan Collins. Charles, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here. Thank you for taking the time to chat with us.
Well, I'm very honored to be here. I'm very happy to be chatting.
Well, good. Well, so, let's dispense with the formalities. You and I recently met. We had the opportunity to talk a couple of weeks ago for part of a 1455 co-sponsored discussion about your new book, which we will absolutely get into. But I would love to tee things up today because there was something that you said during our conversation a couple of weeks ago that not only really piqued my interest, but made me realize you had to be part of this festival because you've got a lot to say on this topic. And I really want to hear your thoughts and your perspective, which is, you mentioned that you've always kind of considered yourself in terms of writing, first and foremost, a storyteller. And I do this not facetiously, because I think what this whole festival is exploring is, what do we mean by storytelling? There's the obvious literal, you're telling a story, but we start getting into the types of books you write, the types of work you've done spanning different genres and different mediums. So if I were to ask you, what do you define storytelling and what kind of storyteller are you?
Well, I usually say that I'm a storyteller because I find it difficult to describe myself as a writer because for a number of reasons. Number one, I never really studied writing. I never took a writing class, and I don't have a lot of formal education. So not long ago, I was talking to a friend and he was talking about my new book. And I said, yeah, but I'm not really a writer. And he said, no, you're not really a writer, but you're a great storyteller. And I think that for me, storytelling, well, I'm the type of person, a lot of unusual things happen to. Like, I think a real writer will take a normal thing and look at it and make it unusual. But for me, like, unusual things happen too. And it always has been that way since I was very young. And I think that started to develop my eye for what people will be interested in hearing. So when I was relaying the anecdote about what happened to me, and I could judge and by the person's reaction whether they were enjoying it or whatever, because writing is a lot like a person who's a good storyteller or long-winded. So you temper it, like you don't want to put in too many details, but yet you want the story to be vivid and you want them to understand. So I just think that in that sense, judging from people that I talk to and going back for years, I think that I'm a fairly good storyteller. And we talked a little bit about that. Started when I was very young. because I used to draw pictures, and I would tell a story almost in a comic book way. I would start out like drawing a person at the beginning of their career and when they were sort of up and coming, and then I would draw pictures of their struggle, and it would tell the whole story in panels. And that was my first introduction. I didn't know I was telling a story to myself, but I was. And I think that that was the beginning. I think to be a good storyteller, number one, you have to be interested in people and events and things like that. So if you're, I always say, if you're telling a story or writing a book or profiling a subject, you have to be interested in it yourself, or no one else will.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about that a lot in 1455 kind of conversations with authors. It sounds so simplistic, but I think like most truisms, there's a profound level of authenticity, which is, you know, how can any writer expect an audience to be interested if it's clear they're not interested? If you're phoning it in,
Right.
or you're not really digging deeper to get at the root of whatever the topic is, that's going to be very apparent. And I think that's even more important in our, you know, increasingly info overload. Maybe 20, 30 years ago, a writer had the luxury of like, someone got this book from the library and, you know, they're committed, they got to dig in. And now, I mean, if you don't catch someone's attention, you got 5 minutes and they're on to a million other things that are freely available.
The attention span of the public, including my own, is just getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Right.
And you have to keep in those small parameters in telling a story. So it's like, I think as a writer, you personally want to get all the details. And if you're writing about a particular person or personality or a celebrity, I know for me, I want to get all the details, just so I have a big picture of the person. But the trick is to weed out what is interesting and what's not interesting and what your readers are going to find interesting, because it's like you're writing for an audience. So if you're writing for an academic audience, then you might want to put in a lot of addresses and dates and you know, events and every little detail for an academic audience. But if you're writing for the general reading public, you have to keep it interesting and moving, or you're going to lose them. And also, I feel that if you cram in too many details into a book, you'll lose the narrative. Like the important things will get lost in the sauce. Like the personality might lose some of their magic. You know, I mean, the landmark events will just be another thing because of everything that came before it. It's all just one long thing. So to keep the narrative, keep the interest, while keeping a personality and a profile, it's a juggling act to decide what to put in and what not to put in, and what to synopsize.
Yeah.
You know, you might have a good example of what to synopsize. Sometimes you read a biography and it starts out with the ancestors of the person.
Right.
Now, those stories might be very, very, very fascinating, and you could get very involved in telling those stories, but you really have to try to like just get to the point with that person.
Yeah.
So I think that one of the things that I've learned to do is like synopsize into a couple of paragraphs a lifetime, but trying to get the feel of this person, the grandmother or the mother or the father's life. So because it's important to know where they came from too.
Sure. Well, you mentioned a real key phrase, which is what to leave in and what to leave out. And one of the ways I love to tease out, the craft of writing effectively, that I think a lot of people may not appreciate is kind of like looking at a professional musician or a professional athlete. The whole point is they make it look easy. They make it look simple. What most people learn to appreciate, especially if you try it and fail, is that a lot of work goes in so that the finished product flows. And one of the things that I really want to celebrate about your style, and I mean, your commercial and critical success bears this out. So I'm happy to pay the compliment, but I'm just stating facts. You've attracted a readership and a credibility, but I'd love you to talk a little bit more, especially for those that are maybe not really understanding what goes into this, the real balancing act. And you touched on it, but you have to start, right? The base of that soup is the facts, the details. But not just synopsizing and not just knowing what to leave and what to leave out, which is an absolute art form, but how to make a compelling narrative. And to me, what you do so well and what the best writers do is thread that line between everything in here is important, everything is factually based, but damn it, I feel like I'm reading a novel. There's an art to that.
Well, thank you. Well, I can't stress enough. The first part for me of writing a biography is being a detective. I have to go out there. I have to find people who knew the person or worked with the person that I'm writing about, relatives, if you can get relatives to talk, even the children of people that knew that person, because usually the stories get passed down if they're interesting enough.
Yeah.
So that gathering all the information, the mundane, the exciting, the trivial, the monumental things, learning all of that and knowing it helps you to, you might be able to say, he hated premieres. He hated going to movie premieres.
Mhm.
That might come from talking to 15 different people and reading 3 interviews, but you could say that with a couple of other words, and you'll get that whole plethora of information that you got by boiling it down to
Yeah.
a couple of lines.
Yeah. 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 And, I guess I think when I think about your book and this book, like when you have a topic, right, where the person is an icon and there's already baggage, in every sense of the word, there's a history baked in. I'm imagining it's a little bit easier to let the narrative take over. I mean, one thing that I find, I feel like it's a more modern trend, and it's more in journalism for sure, but this notion of the intruding narrator, the author tries to make themselves part of the story. Do you have any thoughts about that, and when that's appropriate or not? Or, are there biographies you've read where you can pinpoint how the person is not adequately separating facts from narrative and also respecting the audience, knowing that they know something, but they're there for the main event?
I wouldn't name names, but I've certainly read books where I feel that, from my personal taste, the author is putting himself in it too much. And even though they may be interesting within themselves,
Right.
I said, write a memoir first and get that out of the way, get it all out of your system. And
Yeah.
because it takes you don't want, the one thing for me when I'm reading a biography and then, subsequently when I'm writing one, is I don't want to take the reader outside of that world. And I don't want to come
Yes.
out of the world. And sometimes when you start putting too much of yourself into it, it takes you right out of the story. And that, it interrupts the flow, it interrupts the narrative. And I would never want to do that. But I write about interesting people, the narratives, their lives, their opinions, their work, their personalities are interesting enough. I don't have to put myself in there. Although I think I have to use myself in empathizing or understanding, but that doesn't have to make it into. That could come in the way that I'm presenting.
Right. Well, Charles, talk a little bit about that, because I know, again, from having talked to you, and it's just clear anyone watching can pick up on the fact that you're a very sensitive guy. Talk a little bit about that kind of internal editorializing in terms of tone, and not just the black and white of, well, I got to leave this out because it's extraneous, but the whole tone and being able to be both as objective as possible. But at some point you're rendering judgment, right? Just the facts that you bring in,
Yeah.
there's an element of judgment there. But I think you clearly make that a priority, and it's to your credit. But maybe talk a little bit about, what goes on in your world when you're trying to figure out, I want to be respectful, but I also want to dish the dirt. There's dirt there. Like, I think there's also a balance there.
Yeah, especially if you're doing a Hollywood biography.
Yeah.
There's going to be scandal and there's going to be gossip. What I would like to do is present different sides of the story and try to put some motivation in um, why that scandal happened, or the domino effect of how it came to explosion. So I just think that it's, rather than just put in the salacious kind of stuff, which I think in certain cases has to be put in, although you will be judged for it because people will say he's just writing gossip. But for example, if you're writing about the life of Elizabeth Taylor, a very good person, a very passionate person, a very talented person, but how the hell do you write about Elizabeth Taylor and not have some gossip in there?
Impossible, right?
Right. It's just, so what I always say about that is if you don't want to read gossip about Elizabeth Taylor because she broke up a marriage or two, you know, um, things like that,
Yeah.
read a critical study of her work. You know what I mean? Like find a book that analyzes her movies and gives synopsises and talks about her character approach to the role, because you don't want to really hear about her life unless you want to hear a Valentine, where you
Right.
just talk about how wonderful that person is. And that's only a half truth.
Yeah. Well, Charles, I gotta think, right? The topics you write about, we are in a social media age where everybody's accessible. I'm assuming that you've heard from passionate fans that either wanted more or telling you got the wrong stuff, or how dare you besmirch the, I mean, is that a drawback to being a contemporary writer? That's part of the process, or how do you handle that? Like the super fans?
It hurts. I can't lie. I mean, but it almost makes you, if you read a super fan review and they're saying this, that, and the other thing, the one thing that I wish I could do is respond to and explain, you know, because sometimes I feel that they're just not why I had to put that in there or why that was important to the whole narrative of this person and go behind their motivations. But I think that you have to become jaded enough to let it go and just say you could never write to please everyone, and you have to make those calls yourself ultimately. But, you know, it's hard if you're writing about a well-known personality.
Yeah.
It has a double-edged trick to it, a tricky terrain to explore, because number one, you're writing for someone who maybe read 15 books on the subject and really spent years studying.
Yeah.
And so they want to hear new things, they want to hear new takes, they want to hear, but then you're writing for someone who's picking up the book for the first time.
That's right.
And they don't know anything, or just they have a passing acquaintance with the subject.
Yeah.
So if you start writing about the person's break into show business, there's going to be some stories that you have to put in that are well known because some people don't know. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to use Marilyn Monroe as an example because she's somebody who I know the most about.
Yeah.
I got a deal to write a book about Marilyn Monroe, and the publishers, rightfully so, said Marilyn's been written about a lot. So we want you to really concentrate on what's new. We want you to uncover new things, and we want you to, you know, really concentrate on that so that people can pick up and find new things out. So I'm great with that because I know so much about her. I want to find out.
Right. Right.
But then while I'm in the middle of writing it, funny enough, I was in my dentist chair and the assistant was getting me ready. And she said, you know, what are you doing? What are you working on? And I said, well, I'm doing a book on Marilyn Monroe. She said, I love Marilyn Monroe. I've loved her since I was a child. I'm such a big fan. So we started talking and I said, you know, in her tragic childhood, you know, she was a foster child. And the assistant stopped and said, Marilyn Monroe was a foster child? And I said, well, yeah, you know, she was an orphan and she shuffled around. I didn't know that, she says. And I start realizing, okay, this is a lifelong fan who doesn't know the most fundamental things about Marilyn Monroe. It's got to go in. It's got to go in the book. And what you have to take into consideration, people who are writing the snide reviews about, there's really nothing new in it. You only have 90,000 to 110,000 words to put it all in. So you really have to, you know, sort of, it's like a puzzle to put in. This is new, but yet I still have to put this in. And because someone is going to be picking it up who doesn't know the life story. So you want them to get the sense of this person.
Yeah.
Or you want to put in some new things or take a new approach on some of the old things. And it's so, it's such a balancing act.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's a puzzle, right? And I believe any writer, even fiction, and maybe especially fiction, right? Because you don't even have the luxury with fiction of a world that existed. You're kind of creating the world and justifying it and adding suspense. But the notion of what leads to what and what questions are being answered, I think that what we're getting at here is that it is a very complex. So even something as ostensibly straightforward as writing a biography, I got the facts and I'm putting them out there. The whole art form. One thing you made me think of that I have to say facetiously is the dawn of the internet, when like chat groups and the different fan sites,
forums and all that kind of stuff.
There were a handful who remained nameless for my own humility, but a couple of writers and musicians who I thought, nobody knows as much about X, Y, and Z as I do. No one's as passionate about this. And it took me very short order of time to realize, oh, there are people that are a lot more passionate. And in a healthy way, I was like, okay, I think I'm pretty good with the level of obsession I'm at, but whoa, again, I'm imagining that you've encountered more than your share of people who spend a lot of time thinking about what they are passionate about.
Yeah, I mean, and you'll get challenged on a lot of things, and even if you come to a different conclusion, they'll challenge you on it, and then they'll dislike the whole book if it's even just one thing that you disagree on. Again, going back to Marilyn Monroe, there's a big debate for 40, 50 years. Was she murdered? Was it an accident, or was it a suicide? There's a whole group of people that stringently stick to the thing that Bobby Kennedy went in there that night with a needle and killed her.
Yep.
And if you say, well, he played a part in making her very sad that summer, but he didn't go in there with a poisonous enema or a needle and stuck her under the arm. Yeah. They will attack you, and they will attack your whole book. They will attack your character. Sure. Be fanatical about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there are the people that they have very strong opinions, and they're very well researched, and they can come up with everything that argument you could come up of why this happened. They'll come up with another thing that says this is why it didn't happen.
So suffice it to say, there's certain rabbit holes it's probably better to not go down, because you're not going to win, and like it's short.
I will go down the rabbit hole and I'll try to give the other side a little bit of, this is why it's understandable they believe this way. If I can, if I have enough room, I'll try to do that. I try to please everybody, but that's impossible.
Sure. So Charles, what's sufficiently clear, but what I really want to, get a good grasp on, your touchstone, right, is this golden era of cinema that you have gravitated toward. You obviously have an unbelievable passion and interest and knowledge about. Talk a little bit about your background and what the chicken egg, like I'm imagining, right, that the movies preceded the fascination, which led to yada, yada, yada. But talk a bit about when you realize like this is your sweet spot.
Well, I mean, just basically how I became involved in loving movies was, as a kid, I was a little bit of an outsider. I didn't feel like I fit in very well in the neighborhood and in things like that. But I always felt from watching The Late Show and the afternoon movies that I really felt an affinity towards the old time stars, 30s, 40s, and golden age of Hollywood. We find our people. Whoever our muses are or who inspires us. And they were the first people I found, starting with Marilyn Monroe and then leading to the other ones. And first, because they brought me enjoyment in their movies, but then because I wanted to know about their lives that they led. So I was reading a lot of, at a very young age, before I was even a teenager, I was reading a lot of movie star biographies, and then, waiting to see their movies, or if there was a festival in Manhattan, they were showing a festival of someone, I would go and see it. So that's how it started. And then those people becoming muses to me, and me, being very interested in them, I naturally wanted to write about them. Of course, for me, it wasn't like I couldn't go from A to B. I mean, I had to do other things in order to get there. You can write about them for pleasure, which I recommend. Write them for yourself. Without trying to get them published. But My beginning career was in newspapers and magazines, and sometimes you get a story assigned that is really interesting to you, and sometimes you don't. But it's important though, because you have to learn to make yourself interested in a subject that you're assigned that you're not interested in. You have to find things about it, because again, what we were saying, if you're not interested, you can't make the reader interested. So find things.
Right.
So I think these were all laying the groundwork for me to be able to come to a point where I would be able to write about my passions and my obsessions, and examine the lives of the people that have moved me or inspired me or touched me in some way. So that was the way it went. I mean, I became a celebrity personality profiler or interviewer. I was doing at first I was doing modern day people.
Okay.
People that were in in my world, that were born in my era, that were my contemporary.
Right.
I enjoyed it and it was fun, but they didn't interest me as much as the old time stars. I think one of the reasons for that is the old time star. There's something fascinating about people that are gone and that live their life with parts of their life in mystery.
Right.
There's something very intriguing about going in and trying to crack the mystery and bring a person who is now gone back to life in a new way, in a more in-depth way, with more understanding and everything like that. Because celebrities today, let's face it, they're very open about everything. Every celebrity has a Twitter account or an Instagram account. They're putting things that are happening in their life in real time. So what's there to investigate? So, I can't see people writing books 30 years from today about too many of the celebrities of today, because it'll all be out there.
That's right.
We know them quite well, or not everything, but enough to not be able to do a whole book on.
Yeah, and speaking of rabbit holes, right? We could absolutely take a detour here and really start speculating. I'm ceaselessly fascinated with, speaking of these personalities. I think this is a function of time, right? Because people living in the 50s were probably thinking, how did people in the 20s get information? Like, it's all relative. But I think of Elizabeth Taylor, although she kind of lived at that level where she was being scrutinized. But I think of the Rascals, Peter O'Toole and Oliver Reed and Richard Harris. I mean, obviously things would be different in the sense that their foibles, for better or worse, would be much more in the public eye. But I wonder, even that lifestyle isn't possible today. Even if you had the druthers and said, I want to be a Hellraiser and go out in bars and get in brawls, it's not good for your career. Where then there was that mystery, it was a little more accepted, but it was also kind of sweat. People didn't know about it. We're now absolutely out of the question. Someone with a cell phone in the bar is going to take video. Never mind the paparazzi.
Yeah.
But so I can imagine that there's an inevitable appeal, right? Because you put it perfectly. There's just an inevitable mystery that we'll never know because they're not here anymore.
There's a story behind the stories that we know. There's some very familiar stories, but there's usually a story behind that.
Yeah.
And I just think that that's, so intriguing for a writer to try to crack that. Yeah. Rather than just repeating things that a celebrity of today already, they'll write their own tell-all biography, or you could do a tell-all interview on television, or have do a video, put it on their Twitter account. And so it's just really hard. And the other thing is, because of the mystery of the stars from the golden age and not knowing that much about them and not seeing them every day the way we do the celebrities of today, they were held separate from us. They were in a different box of our everyday life, where the celebrities today are like us. They're the same. They have the same opinions. They eat the same food because they're posting pictures of the food. So there's really not that much to say. I love your work, but your life, it doesn't really interesting that much. You're the same as the person sitting next to me on the subway in many ways.
That's right. And I think, inevitably certain types of people are probably disappointed by that because they want to have the mystery and the kind of rock star. And so, like I said,
that's reflected a little bit, not to if you've noticed in the past few years, the viewership of award shows like the Academy Awards and the Golden Globes is falling every year. And it's not because the work is falling, because I think everyone's doing just as good work as anyone's ever done, if not better than anyone's ever done. But it used to be an event to turn on the Academy Awards and see stars that you very rarely saw outside of their movies.
That's right.
And you didn't hear from them, so you would want to see how they looked, what they wore. That's not part of a mystique anymore.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
yeah. So I don't want to move on too quickly. I think one of the things that I personally, I won't say I struggle with, but I'm fascinated by is, of course, in my, modest and humble role at 1455, I want to encourage everybody, and I don't want to discourage any writers, but I also always want to give props to the practitioners who have reached a certain level, because we need to make sure people understand there's no luck involved. It's always full of hard work and tons of rejection. But if you would be so kind, talk a little bit more, just so people can really appreciate. I want to hear a little bit about, at some point, I think you must have taken a leap of faith and said, I've definitely built a career. Now I'm ready, or I'm going to be ready, or I need to be ready to write a book. But I think it's worth spending another minute or two with you talking a bit about journalism, just so people have an understanding, because I don't know if the rules have changed that much in terms of, because I get asked all the time, right? And I'm a nobody, but people say, how do I become you? Or how do I do this? And part of the right is you've got to do a lot of writing. But maybe talk a little bit about how, your background and being willing, right? Not just able, but being willing to take assignments that, you didn't just jump in and go, I think I want to be a Marilyn Monroe expert. Oh, well, fortunately, there's 50 articles you can write, right? You had to carve out your space. So there's just, again, we keep coming back to balance, this balance of having to make a living, having to refine your craft, pay some dues, but steadily work toward what you really want to do.
Yeah, I mean, there's even the greatest writers that that I'm familiar with, or that I know, that have to teach. Because although their work is very, and this goes all the way back. I mean, the great writers, like Cheever and all, they had to teach because they didn't just make enough as a writer. There's so much. It's so important to understand that for most people, for me, it didn't. It just doesn't happen overnight. There's a long progression of starting out for the smaller press and then moving to the bigger press, and taking on lots of assignments. And for me, I really never made a living as an adult outside of writing, but I had to learn to become a ghostwriter. All different kinds of writers. I worked with people who wanted to write a book but weren't really writers, so they would hire me to tell their story to, and then put it in book form. And I worked for newspapers and took assignments that weren't really up my alley. But you start learning. The most important thing for me was follow your interest and follow your passion. Because to get a book deal today is really about the pitch. I mean, it's like you have to take your subject that you decide that you're very passionate about and you want to tell the story, but you have to write a pitch. You have to write a proposal, because unless you're the biggest of stars, you're not going to get a book deal without a proposal. Yeah. So find someone you're passionate about, and then you have to find out in a proposal. I find in my proposals, you have to convince. It's all because the people that are going to be reading the proposal are going to be reading it not with, why should I make this book? Why should I do this book? Why should I not do this book?
Right.
So the proposal is about convincing them why people are going to want to read it, why this person is relevant today, what other books have come out recently that prove that this kind of a book could work. So it's got to really be someone that you're very passionate about and convinced that you could tell the story in a way that no one else can.
Right.
Or hasn't been told before. You know, if it's someone who's been written about a lot, you could tell the story in a way that hasn't been told before. And there's a lot of stick-to-itiveness to it. I mean, you're going to go through periods in your career where you're very busy. And then you might, like me, go through periods where I just wasn't getting writing assignments. And it was really, really, really difficult.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes you're writing, you know, just for yourself. But then there's other times when you're writing because you want to work. So, you know, it's like when you're just writing for yourself, you got to think of pitches to pitch to a magazine, a story that you want to pitch to a magazine, or it's. But you know, that being said, that's me. I mean, I think that the most important thing is you find your own way of what works for you.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Maybe you're just very instinctual to put your finger on the pulse of knowing what would be really a great story or a great book to do right now.
Yeah.
It's a journey.
Well, and you know, Charles, I want to recognize, you know, and acknowledge and really kind of hold you up as an antidote of sorts to what I would say is kind of the cynicism of the modern publishing complex, which is, I think a lot of people will give advice, even if it's well intended, where they say, you know, study the trends and, you know, what's going on now in the world. And here's what agents and editors are looking for this year. I'm the last person to just, like I said, I don't want to discourage anyone from following any path or any muse, but I think you prove, right? Your career proves, and this doesn't apply to everybody, but you prove if you're passionate about something and you have established an authority in it, that's going to give you the credibility to make that pitch, but B, it's going to see the project through trends and fads, right? I mean, Marilyn Monroe is always going to be notorious and popular, but she's not as popular right now as, I'm not even gonna say Madonna or whoever. So I think it's important also for younger writers to appreciate that that's not the magic, like it's not a magic cure to just find something you love and the world will follow. But I think a definite path to the disappointment is to think that you got your finger on the pulse, because that pulse can change at a moment's notice. And you know, trends are fickle.
You have to take your passion and make it marketable.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because when I was doing this book about Elizabeth Taylor and the friendship that she had with Montgomery Clift, and everyone knows Elizabeth Taylor, but Montgomery Clift, thank you. Although I think he's not as remembered today by people. So one thing that I heard of when, you know, the naysayers were saying about this book, they would say, well, no one knows who Montgomery Clift is. And I said, well, let me introduce him. And now when someone says that, I say, well, now they do, because because I, you know, I'm gonna toot my own horn and say, because my book is, you know, introducing them to him, making them again. So what I did with the drawbacks of saying that I wanted to do a book that included Montgomery Clift is I concentrated on the story. I said, let's take Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift out of the running of why I wanted to do the story of 17-year-old movie star in 1950 who falls in love with a gay movie star who's closeted in 1950. The story alone is worth telling. But then you put in Elizabeth Taylor and Montgomery Clift and you name the classic movies, the story becomes so much more. It's so much more to me about the story that you're going to tell within the person that you're going to be telling about. Stories, you know, the stories that you're going to tell. Because even someone who's not well known might have a fascinating story to tell. So you have to convince that the story is worth telling. I have to convince anyway.
Right. And then, talk about the process of discovery. Like maybe you knew this because you have this, you know, wellspring of knowledge and expertise, but certainly, you know, I would call myself someone that knows Elizabeth Taylor. She was, I was born in the 70s. So, I mean, I knew her through the latter part of her life, but, you know, for me, your book and the stories deepens my appreciation for her as a human being, and also adds layers of complexity that I think are absolutely critical to any real biography. And I also happen to think that the kind of work you're doing is very consistent with our time, where we are, I think as a culture, we're very, I don't know if obsessed is the right word, but we're very interested in unpacking the past and saying, are these narratives reliable? And do we need to re-examine and contextualize something like understanding, for instance, and I'll let you elaborate, but just where I'm going with this is understanding her relationship with Montgomery Clift doesn't explain her advocacy for gay rights, but it certainly deepens and shows some context in terms of this certainly colored in part how she came to be later in life. So that right there, for me as a reader, was profoundly interesting and informative.
Well, thank you. And I do think that that's one of the trails I follow to make the book more unique or contemporary, just following how the relationship between Montgomery Clift might have ignited some of that passion she had for AIDS advocacy. But other things as well is that I found that I could sort of bring it up to date or make it interesting to modern audiences is there seems to be, just as far as, Montgomery Clift was a gay actor and he had to be closeted. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been a Montgomery Clift. It's just that simple. But I noticed that with some of the newer generations of gay people, they kind of feel a resentment towards the stars like Rock Hudson or Montgomery Clift, who had to live a closeted life, because they have this kind of sense that all as they needed was a little pluck, and just stood up to some of the studios, and they could have come out and they would have advanced the whole industry, and we would have gotten there much quicker. It wasn't like that. So I felt really passionately about saying, this is what it was like in 1948 to be not only an actor, to be anyone who was gay.
That's
right. It was against the law. You wouldn't have a career. You would be considered a pervert, dangerous, and you would just have to live in the shadows.
Yeah.
So that was another very important thing about making it, contemporary.
Just thinking 1948, Charles, that was closer to Oscar Wilde being imprisoned for homosexuality than we are to today. So they're right there. I mean, we were what was 40 years before, or 45 years previous. And I think you and I can both agree, right? I mean, I'm a child, like I said, of the 70s, 80s, 90s. In the 80s, it was, I think the younger generation doesn't quite appreciate it. It wasn't different. It was a completely alternate world in terms of, so then you go back 30, 40 years from the 80s.
Right.
But I think it's great that you are helping contextualize. I think that's important, again, for anyone, because as the past gets further away, it is harder for the subsequent generations to have that necessary context. So I appreciate your point about younger people, even if they mean well, saying, oh, they should have been braver, and they were plenty brave, which isn't to say that they couldn't have done different things. But yes, people need to respect that, the whole way the world worked was radically different.
Yeah, understand it. Even, another thing about, like, say the scandal when Elizabeth Taylor broke up Eddie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds' marriage. I mean, today that would kind of be like maybe a news cycle, but in that day, the country was obsessed for months.
Right.
About Elizabeth Taylor stealing another woman's husband. It was just so, the morals of the day, the judgment of the day, and it wasn't that people didn't steal other people's husbands or wives or anything. It's just that you couldn't talk about it, So Elizabeth in that way was bringing things like living for the moment, living for yourself, not always listening to what society says. There's a lot of things about Monty and Elizabeth that are really admirable in so many ways.
Yeah. Well, so the other thing, I didn't have an agenda. I mean, I'm enjoying this thoroughly. But the one thing that I think we've danced around that I definitely want you to weigh in on, because we talked about balance, we talked about paying dues and cultivating craft and all those important things. I don't know if we've really hammered it home, and I think you can for us, the notion of you have to love and respect the process. And by process, the research, what goes on when you're not writing, what goes on when you're writing, what goes on when you're editing and revising. But right, would you agree with me that if you don't learn to love that, it's going to be a very difficult path?
Absolutely. I mean, or you should do something else. If you don't, it would be like a flight attendant saying, I love my job, but I don't like to fly, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, for me, when I'm doing a biography, every step, and there's a lot, but every step of the way is fun too, and very, very interesting. The detective part that I talked about of going and finding the facts and making the phone calls and tracking down people, it's fun. I'm interested in my subject, so I want to find out as much as I can.
Sure.
Then the writing part is in general fun. You don't always feel like writing. You have to write sometimes when you don't feel like it, but for the most part, it's fun recreating this person or telling readers what you found out about them, what you want them to know about it. Then there's a whole editing process where your editor will come back and say, you need a little bit more description here, or you go a little bit overboard there, or so then there's whole that. And then for me, you have a legal read where a lawyer reads it and says, So you have to do, there's a lot of process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And don't forget the notes, because a lot of people are going to want to know, well, where do you get that from? So you have to put, well, this comes from this particular interview in 1966, or this person who worked with her told me that, so there's a lot of steps in doing it. It's really, I think it's really important to like all of those steps if you go on and do it, because you don't have to like them all the same, but you have to like them all to a certain degree.
Sure. Now, Charles, I don't want to date either of us because clearly we're in our mid to late 30s.
I'm 100 years old.
But I'm curious what your take is. Let's say we straddle the analog era in our upbringing and from when we were first doing research. I think sometimes, and as a critic and a lot of the journalism I've done, on balance, having access to information at my fingertips is an absolute blessing. But are there times when it's too much of a good thing and you can find yourself almost being buried in research and knowing when enough is enough? And do you struggle at all with having basically this repository of a data dump on our computers?
Well, for me, the way that affects it is it makes writing a book on a celebrity or a well-known person more difficult, because you don't want to use too much stuff that you can just find on the internet, because then why would people buy the book? So you can't do all your research from sitting there and just following, reading Wikipedia entries and then rewriting a Wikipedia entry. I mean, it's very, very helpful to have it, though. I mean, even if you just need to check something, a date or something, and to have it at your fingers. I sometimes marvel when I'm reading a book that was written before we had all of this technology, and it's so detailed and it's all and the notes, and they're so, how did they do it? It's just, I have so much admiration for them.
Yeah.
But I like to go, first of all, I like to find people that I could talk to, new people to get new information. And I like to go into the archives. If the person has an archive that they left to a library or a museum or something, that you can go and you can read through their letters or through their scripts with the notes on it and everything. But so the way that the at your fingertips technology helps is that, yes, it's great to be able to, but also tracking down people. You can track down people much easier if you're looking for so-and-so's daughter. You can find them a little bit. Maybe they have a Facebook page. Whereas in the old days, you had to get a giant phone book and call each town and say, "Do you have a Jane Doe?" So it's very helpful, but the downside is, yeah, a lot of information is out there, and you can't just use that, because then you don't really have a book.
Right. What I'm really taking away, Charles, is a renewed appreciation, really, of the detective work. I think any serious reader or anyone that's been to grad school, for that matter, gets what goes into a thesis paper, much less a book. But I think I'm even getting a deeper appreciation for, and I don't just mean detective work in the kind of literal or figurative sense, but like there's a human element. I think we overlook the kind of writing you do, making the contacts. Like you have to be a high functioning human as well as a high functioning researcher and writer. So props, because it does combine a lot of skills, right?
Yeah, and I'm very uncomfortable calling people that I don't know. Like I'm just, and so, for example, Elizabeth Taylor made a movie in the 50s called Raintree County, and it was a big epic movie. So a lot of people, are still alive. And so I tracked some of them down, and I would always prefer to send an email first and introduce myself, tell them what I'm doing. But sometimes you just have to cold call. And that you're coming in and you're explaining, it makes me very uncomfortable. I do it, but I mean, it makes me uncomfortable.
I think any normal person is uncomfortable making and receiving those calls, so it kind of balances out.
Yeah.
Charles, the big question, and I'm sure this is going to be difficult to answer in a couple of minutes, but thinking of success, we talk about how do you measure storytelling? A lot of ways. How do you measure success? Well, critical, commercial, but how do you define success from project to project, both on a personal level, and when do you feel like, and maybe that's the answer, when you're able to leave a particular task and move on to the next one? I'm sure that in itself is a measure of succeeding, but talk a little bit about how you kind of assess yourself and measure projects that you've done.
It's evolved. It's evolved through the years. I mean, earlier when I was just starting out, I think that if I finished something and I was pleased with it, I thought that was a success. But I'm in many ways I'm a needy person, or I don't have like a lot of confidence. So to go from project to project, I do need some positive feedback, especially in the earlier time of my career when I was unsure whether people wanted to read me or not. And so I think that earlier in my earlier years as a writer, if I didn't get positive feedback from people, I might have not continued. So the positive feedback, the finishing it and then get positive later on in my career, finishing it and getting positive feedback was a success because it gave me the confidence to go on to another one. Now that I'm 100 years old, I want some kind of financial, I do, because I have to make a living at it. So
that's right.
To have the complete satisfaction or feeling of success, enough to make me live on until at least the next project, people who really enjoyed it, and me feeling that's almost as good as I could have done. And I say almost because always if you had another year, you could feel like you could have done it better. But it's only in the time frame that I had, that's as good as I could have done. All of those things, I think, for me, one or two of them is a success. But the trifecta to have all three is,
Right. And again, I mean, here we are again, coming back to balance, right? It's a balance of, I think it's fair to say that good writers become their own harshest critics. So, instinctively when you're leaving it all in the field, and I think that makes rejection or failure easier to swallow because you've done it justice. But very few of us want to bother writing if we're not trying to reach an audience. But I think you bring something, and you did it in your typically modest and very gracious way. But one of the missions, right, of 1455 is we talk about building community. And I think some of that can be buzzwordy and sound cute. One of the modest things we're trying to do is I think we can use kind of our modern ability to connect and communicate. Writing is so solitary. Writing is oft filled with rejection or not even being acknowledged. So understanding that other people are going through the exact same things, or finding micro communities that can support one another and offer edits and feedback. All of this stuff is the lifeblood. And it's very important. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I think, especially for non-writers, it can be overlooked, but it's a critical, we're all human.
Yeah.
And, humans that are doing hard work, often alone, really do need that feedback and support.
Yeah, like I think a workshop be a great thing for writers, where you read each other's work and, you know, you comment on it and you get honest feedback, not agenda feedbacks, real honest feedback. I think that that would be a great thing. I mean, I would do that, you know, if I can go back 80 years. Go back 80 years.
God, you look good for 100, Charles.
Thanks.
So we've had this problem before, so I got two things to say. One, we will continue this conversation because there's more meat on that bone. But in closing, since we're running out of time, people are watching this and are inspired and probably even envious in the best ways. But someone's saying, "But Charles, I hear you, but I want to be you. Where do I start? What do I do?" What's a piece of advice you'd give in addition to what you've already said for someone that, you know, is really ambitious and trying to find a foothold?
Well, I would say don't try to be me. You know, find yourself. You know, really. And I also mean it in a serious way, in the sense of, I think that a lot of times when we're starting out and new, we have our writers that have inspired us. For me, the writers that I love were my teachers. You know, they're the one who taught me. So start with the people that you love, read them a lot, and then there'll be a time when you kind of emulate them or sound like them. Find your own voice. You know, I think that's very important. Find your own. Yes, use them as a guideline, let them help you get to the next level, but then find your own voice in doing it. And always follow your bliss, but be and you know, be confident, but listen to other people too. Listen to what they say. Because no one's gonna love our work the way we do. You know, I think
Right.
we're gonna love it after we work so long, and it's almost like a child. So, but you also have to listen to what other people say. Sometimes it's hard, but you know, like an editor, sometimes you disagree with your editor, but really try to understand why they're saying it. Sometimes they do know more than you.
Yeah. Well, Charles, the best compliment I can give you is that you make an hour fly by and
That is the
want
best compliment.
more. So you must be onto something, both as a storyteller and a writer. I want to thank you again, Charles, first of all, for being here. I want to thank you for writing this book and all the other ones. And again, open invitation. 1455 is always going to be interested in hearing what you have to say. So I appreciate you taking the time, and I'm really looking forward to what you get up to next.
Thank you. It was I enjoyed it so much. It was a stimulating talk, and yeah, the hour flew by for me too. So thank you.
Right on. Well, we'll see you soon. Folks, thank you for being here, telling stories about old school cinema icons. Charles Casillo, you can find him online. We'll put information on our website, and we're going to post this to our YouTube page after the festival. Thank you for being part of this festival. We're pleased you spent time with us. And if you want to know more about 1455, you can check us out at 1455litarts.org. We have free programming throughout the year, and we encourage you to get involved. So enjoy the rest of the festival, and we'll see